1985 and 1980. Most of them were in their late teens or early 20s by the 1980s, which is often held up as their equivalent to the boomers' 60s in terms of when their influence on American youth culture was assumed to be peaking. And how, you ask, did that youth culture manifest? Well, one big thing is that the 1980s heralded the dawn of very teen-centric and high school-centric movies, which proved very popular for young Gen X audiences for how well their plots and actors captured what it was like to be young. Musically, the late 80s saw the rise of grunge and hip-hop as popular new genres with huge youth appeal, featuring lyrics and sound that supposedly captured the often weary and cynical spirit of Gen X existence. Politically, Gen X youth were famously apathetic, but they were associated with at least a few high-profile causes that began to rise during the 1980s, namely the increasingly high profile of environmental activism and pro-gay activism during the AIDS crisis. Okay, so that being the broad summary, to what degree can we say that these manifestations of 80s youth culture were actually led by Gen Xers? Well, to begin, a quick IMDb survey suggests that Gen X actors were in fact relatively common in many of the most beloved youth-centered movies of the time, though they tended to be on the older end of the spectrum, and plenty of iconic Gen X youth heroes were actually played by boomers. Matthew Broderick, for instance, who starred in the much-beloved Gen X flick Ferris Bueller's Day Off, was born in 1962, making him a younger boomer. John Cusack, of boombox holding fame and Say Anything, was born in 1966, making him just over the Gen X line. Of the 5 Breakfast Club teens, 3 were boomers and 2 were older Gen X. John Hughes, who directed Ferris Bueller and The Breakfast Club and often gets credit for being the Hollywood voice of Gen X youth, was born in 1950, however. Of the 5 main members of the pioneering rap group NWA, 2 were boomers, and 1, Dr. Dre, was born on the transition year of 1965. All but one of the Public Enemy guys were boomers. On the grunge side, Kurt Cobain of Nirvana was a Gen Xer, but Chris Cornell of Soundgarden was a young boomer, as was Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, with both of them being born in 1964. Over on the political side, the pioneering environmentalist group Greenpeace was founded in 1970 by 3 people, Philip Coates, Irving Stowe, and Jim Bolin, who continued to lead the group during the 1980s. They were all part of the silent generation. Not even boomers. That surprised me to learn. In 2016, the magazine Esquire published a list of the 15 most impactful people in the history of AIDS activism during the 1980s. Every single person was either a boomer or a silent, except for Ryan White, who was technically a Gen Xer, but also did his activism as a child. All right, now after Gen X comes my generation, the Millennials, the generation that is currently the most aggressive in demanding that everyone care about our nostalgia. Pew says we were born somewhere between 1981 and 1996. Peak millennial youth culture is usually said to have spanned the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, and in many ways built on the conventions established by Gen X. We had plenty of teen-centric films too, as well as a vast number of teen-centric TV shows about high school-aged people getting up to all sorts of relatable misadventures. Musically, I feel our youth culture is associated with the golden age of so-called boy bands and girl groups, featuring quite young singers, as well as increasingly young musicians more broadly. We are also considered the first generation to have a high degree of internet literacy, with a lot of early social media being portrayed as a technology that emerged in the early 2000s by and for people under 30. Like the Gen Xers, we were considered to have been relatively politically apathetic during our youth, though our peak decade did overlap with some relatively aggressive anti-capitalist activism at times. Okay, so let's now do the age audit. Of the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, perhaps the 2 most iconic boy bands of the late 1990s, only 1 member qualifies as a millennial, Justin Timberlake, who was born right on the cutoff date of 1981. Of the 6 combined members of TLC and Destiny's Child, there is only one millennial, Beyoncé, who is also a 1981 baby. Britney Spears was born in 1981 as well, while Christina Aguilera is just barely not a millennial since her birthday is in December of 1980. Eminem, however, is a pretty solid Gen Xer, born in 1972. Teen movies and TV shows of the late 90s and early 2000s continued the practice of hiring actors who were often quite a bit older than the characters they portrayed. As one of my Twitter followers noted when I posted about this the other day, none of the sexy teens in Dawson's Creek, Cruel Intentions, or American Pie were technically millennials. Neither were the male leads in the OC, a show I liked quite a lot when I was young, though the female leads were. Michael Cera is a millennial, however, born in 1988. So is Anne Hathaway, born in 1982. Lena Dunham, who was born in 1986 and created the popular millennial drama Girls, is rare in being a millennial director who made a show about millennial-aged people. Most directors of teen or young adult-centric media of this era tended to be Gen Xers or boomers. The director of Superbad, Greg Mottola, for instance, was born in 1964. It's a similarly mixed bag when we look at how much influence millennials had over the early internet. Mark Zuckerberg is a millennial, born the same year as me, in fact. The 2 founders of Reddit are both millennials as well, but Twitter founder Jack Dorsey is a Gen Xer, as are the 3 founders of YouTube. Now, when I was in college, I remember that the 2 great Bibles of the anti-consumerist millennial left were No Logo by Naomi Klein, who was born in 1970, and Adbusters magazine, which was founded in 1989 by 2 silent generation guys. The Adbusters people would go on to help instigate the Occupy Wall Street movement of the late 2000s, which also featured a lot more non-millennials than people often remember. According to a 2012 poll of people at New York's Zuccotti Park, which was the home base of the protest, 49% of the protesters were millennials, while 38% were Gen X. A 2011 article in The Atlantic identifying 5 budding stars of Occupy Wall Street who played a leading role in the movement named 2 millennials and 3 Gen Xers. Okay, and lastly, let us just do a quick overview of the youth culture of the Zoomers, the kids born after 1996, and the generation that we could say much of our present-day youth culture revolves around. Although, if we use the previous 3 generations as our standard, Zoomers are likely starting to enter their decline as America's dominant youth demographic at the moment, given that the oldest Zoomers are now getting close to 30. By and large, the trends of the previous 2 generations have continued when it comes to TV and movies. Zach and Cody are both millennials, for instance, as are iCarly, Zoe 101, and Frankie Off the Chisel. Okay, I made that last one up, but give me a break. I'm old. These young people shows just sound like complete nonsense to me. It does seem, however, that musicians are trending younger. Billie Eilish was born in 2001, making her pretty close to the base age of her young audience. Lil Nas X is a similar story, born in 1999. Olivia Rodrigo, meanwhile, is only 20 years old, making her one of the youngest mega successful pop stars in history. Ed Sheeran is a pretty solid millennial, however, while Post Malone is right on the brink. Zoomer youth culture is also notable for being the first youth culture to rally around celebrities who primarily exist online in the form of streamers and YouTubers and most recently TikTokers. A lot of these people really exemplify the impenetrability of Zoomer culture to the older set, but how many of them are really Zoomers themselves? Well, Logan Paul, perhaps the most infamous Zoomer superstar, is 1 year too old to be a Zoomer, born in 1995. The streaming pioneer Ninja is 4 years older than him, and PewDiePie is 2 years older than Ninja. Mr. Beast is very much a Zoomer, however, born in 1998. You know who is a lot older than I expected, however? Notch, the guy behind Minecraft. He is technically a young Gen Xer, born in 1979. Although the guy that made the Zoomer classic Five Nights at Freddy's is even older than that, born in 1978, the same year as Link Neal from Good Mythical Morning. So, in conclusion, based on this admittedly very cursory and superficial glance at the last 50 years of American youth culture, is Louis Menand's thesis true? Well, it definitely feels like it is more true than not. The idea that youth culture is something that youths primarily consume rather than make